If you've poked around RPG circles for a decent amount of time, you'll have come across someone who mentions the concept of railroading, and talks about how bad it is. Railroading refers to the actions of a dungeon master who limits the player's choices, and I'll define it more specifically as forcing the PCs to do things that they don't want to. It's like you're on an actual railroad. There's only one place that you can travel, and there's no possibility of driving off the track that's already been laid out. In a game, railroading can take the form of invincible NPCs who constantly tell the heroes what to do, or the DM insisting out of character that they haven't planned for the players to do anything that they hadn't written down already, or even a super restrictive setting where every single path implausibly leads to the same destination. All of these examples that I've talked about aren't very fun for most players. The freedom to let your character do whatever you want is arguably the biggest draw to role-playing games. And if the Dungeon Master doesn't give the players real choices, then they're taking away from the collaborative nature of the game, and they might as well just be writing a book. Some newer DMs might hear about the concept of railroading and immediately avoid directing their players in any form. They'll try to run a pure sandbox campaign with a completely open world and no clear goal for the players. I don't really recommend this, mostly because sandbox games are incredibly hard to run, requiring you to either prepare a massive amount of material or be really good at improv, possibly both. Fortunately, there's plenty of middle ground between completely linear and completely open-ended. And there are plenty of ways to guide your players and pre-plan major story beats without feeling railroady. Remember that definition I came up with, forcing the PCs to do things that they don't want to. The key phrase to me is things they don't want to. If your plot hooks are things that all of your players and PCs care about, then they probably won't feel railroaded at all, even if you do have to nudge them here and there. Because of this, the entries on this list will be pretty much evenly split between short-term tactics to work around ignored plot hooks and long-term strategies for making sure that the party is invested in those plot hooks to begin with. The bottom line isn't that you shouldn't give the players any hints or guide them in any way. It's that you should incorporate them in a way that's flexible and satisfying. And I'll spend this video trying to elaborate on that. So here we go. My first tip is to straight up tell your players what the campaign is about during character creation, or otherwise the first time that you meet. Obviously, you shouldn't go through every plot twist or anything like that, but you should provide a basic overview of what the characters will be up to on the level of a movie trailer or the back cover of a book. Something like, this tyrant is oppressing the kingdom, and your characters are rebels who are being hunted down while trying to find a way to overthrow him. That way, the players can keep the game's concept in mind when building a character, and hopefully they won't end up making someone whose goal runs completely counter to the adventure you'd planned. Plus, the players will have a much clearer idea of what to do when receiving plot hooks in the early stages of the campaign. Yes, this technically involves guiding the players out of character, but that's much more palatable when you do it before the game starts. In the same way that a movie director can say all they want before a scene is set, but the director talking to the actors in the middle of a shot will break immersion in the finished product. On a similar note, you should probably wait until after your players have finished making their characters to flesh out things like NPCs and specific plot points. I've mentioned this offhand in a couple of previous videos, but I think it's especially important for ensuring that your players will follow the story that you've planned. A group of religious crusaders is going to be motivated by very different things than a group of ragtag bounty hunters, and you should know how to leverage the PC's motivations to keep the party on track. By default, every D&D character has at least one bond, which will often take the form of an NPC that they care about. A player character is much more likely to listen to someone who's relevant to their backstory than a random schmuck that they meet on the road. If a player doesn't want to bother helping someone that's supposed to be dear to them according to their character sheet, then that's really the player's problem, not yours. Again, this isn't about not giving plot hooks, it's about giving plot hooks that'll be reliable and satisfying. Next up, you should really be planning your campaign one chapter at a time. These chapters might be as short as a single session, or as long as maybe 10 sessions for something like a long journey or extensive dungeon crawl. But I don't really think that you should plan an entire long-term campaign from start to finish before you actually start playing, because it'll promote restrictive thinking and usually doesn't account for unexpected player decisions. Plus, it can be very frustrating if you spend hours planning an encounter in an area that you find out the PCs will never go to. For example, if your campaign is about repelling an invasion of hobgoblins, then there's a chance that your party becomes more interested in arming and training the kingdom's peasants to defend themselves than assassinating the hobgoblin warlord. In this case, you'll thank yourself for not having made super specific plans for the campaign's future, so you can more easily rewrite the next couple of sessions to be about stealing a stash of weapons without having wasted too much of your time. Now we've moved on to tips for implementing individual plot points, and the first one is to make sure that exposition can be given in multiple places or using multiple NPCs. Generally speaking, exposition isn't something that your players will be deliberately looking for, so you shouldn't blame them for not going to a specific place at a specific time just because you were supposed to deliver a plot point there. Let's say your campaign involves a vengeful wraith that the PCs can identify by observing the rune it carves into its victims' skulls. You shouldn't make it so that the only place where they can discover this rune is a specific fortress, even if NPCs keep reminding the heroes that no one has come back from the place in weeks. Sure, you can write an encounter there, but the PCs might decide that they have other things to attend to. Rather than having them wander aimlessly until enough NPCs have convinced them to go check out the fortress, you should have them encounter a different group of the Wraith's victims somewhere else in the world, whether it's a fallen caravan or the corpse of an NPC that they were supposed to meet at a rendezvous point. Plus, the reveal of monstrous threats at an unexpected time can also raise tension in the campaign. More on that later. Next up, I think that your setting should err on the smaller side if you want to leave the adventure with lots of choices. Like I said earlier, running a completely open campaign in a massive city or whole continent is incredibly difficult, as there's no way that you can map out every single problem or point of interest in such a huge setting. Even if the players have a definitive goal but no one clear way to solve it, there's a chance that the heroes will end up wandering into an area that you haven't written about, at which point you might have to resort to railroady tropes like implausible one-way passages and NPCs jumping in to remind the characters of the latest plot hook. On the other hand, it is possible to detail everything of interest in a single valley or small town. In that case, you'll be able to write up an open-ended adventure with numerous plot hooks that the players are likely to stumble upon naturally, even if they miss something initially. My last piece of advice, and the one that I think is the most important of all, is that you should plan conflicts not by writing out what you expect the PCs to do, but by writing out what will happen if the PCs don't get involved. Whether it's a long-term outline for the whole campaign or a couple of quick notes for a single encounter, an event or arc should be defined by what's at stake. Not only is this more practical than predicting PC's behavior, since it's your own actions you're in control of and not the players, it can raise tension in the campaign while simultaneously keeping the players on track. If the players hear about one isolated rumor of dragons attacking villagers, then they might not pay too much attention to it. But if a week passes and they return to a familiar village only to find it burned to the ground, then that's a cue for them to hunt this dragon down. I'm going to be completely transparent about this. I stole this idea from the Keeper's Handbook in Monster of the Week, but I think it can be applied to any game. Well, in its purest form, it can only work in a campaign about protecting people or thwarting evil, which describes most but not all D&D games. But even if your campaign is about ragtag mercenaries or convicts living only for themselves, it could still work if you change the phrase, "what would happen if the PCs weren't there," to "what would happen if the PCs didn't stop any of this." Also, if you're going to use this sheet specifically, keep in mind that the actual names like day, shadows, nightfall, etc. are completely metaphorical. The passage of time in between each step could be anything from a few minutes to a few months. Overall, I think that if you use the countdown technique, your adventures will feel plenty open-ended, and there won't be any need to goad the players in any direction unless they're really oblivious to the threat at hand. So yeah, those are my thoughts on making your campaigns feel more open-ended without going to the extreme of writing an entire sandbox campaign. Keep in mind that what counts as railroading can vary from player to player. New players will often prefer more concrete plot hooks and some guidance out of character, while experienced players might want more freedom and might want to try to solve problems in unorthodox ways. Let me know if these strategies wouldn't work for your group, or if you have your own methods for making your campaigns seem more open-ended and less artificial. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.